Taxi driver kicks poor passenger out, then realizes he's the owner of the cab company. He refused to drive the man, calling him too broke for the fare. The next day he was summoned to the office, where his boss turned out to be the man he had refused to help. The city glowed under the drizzle of neon lights and street lamps. Raindrops drummed against the pavement, forming tiny rivers along the curb. Pedestrians hurried by, their umbrellas forming a sea of black domes, each person lost in their own world. Among them, standing at the edge of the street, Keanu Reeves, clad in a worn-out hoodie and faded jeans, raised his hand to hail a taxi. The first two cabs sped past without slowing down. He exhaled softly, unfazed. It always amazed him how quickly people judged others based on appearances. He wasn't frustrated, just observing. A yellow cab finally slowed to a stop in front of him. The driver, Paul, barely spared him a glance before rolling down the window, just enough to speak. "Where to?" he asked, his voice flat. Keanu smiled. "The Grand Regent Hotel, please." Paul's eyes flickered with doubt. His gaze traveled from Keanu's wet sneakers to his unkempt beard and the well-worn backpack slung over his shoulder. Everything about this guy screamed broke. "You got cash?" Paul asked, gripping the steering wheel. Keanu nodded, already reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a crumpled $50 bill, extending it through the gap in the window. Paul chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "Yeah, right. I've seen this before. That's the last of what you got, isn't it? You'll get in, then you'll beg me to take you for free." "Nah, not tonight." Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying the man. There was no real anger in Paul's voice, just cold certainty, the kind of certainty that came from years of assuming the worst in people. "I'll pay up front if that makes you feel better," Keanu offered, his voice calm. Paul snorted. "And what if you run out before we get there? Or what if that 50 is fake?" Keanu let out a quiet chuckle. "You think I'm scamming you for a cab ride?" Paul shrugged. "I think you're wasting my time." A moment of silence passed between them. The rain pattered softly against the car's hood. Pedestrians bustled by, unaware of the quiet moment unfolding in the taxi queue. Keanu could have insisted. He could have pulled out his metal credit card or even mentioned his name. But that wasn't the point. He didn't want to force respect. He wanted to see if it would be given freely. He simply nodded, stepping back from the curb. "No worries," he said, smiling. "Have a good night." Paul scoffed. "Yeah, sure," he muttered, rolling up the window before pulling away. Keanu watched the taxi disappear down the rainy street. A lesser man might have felt humiliated, might have fought back with words or ego, but Keanu Reeves was no ordinary man. He simply turned and walked toward the Grand Regent Hotel, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. The Grand Regent Hotel towered over the city, its golden lights reflecting off the wet pavement. As Keanu stepped into the lobby, the staff immediately recognized him. "Mr. Reeves, welcome back," the concierge beamed. Keanu smiled, nodding in acknowledgement, but his mind was elsewhere. The taxi driver's assumption, his certainty, it wasn't new. Keanu had spent a lifetime observing how people treated others based on nothing more than surface impressions. He had once been a struggling young actor, living paycheck to paycheck, riding the subway, sleeping on friends' couches. Back then, he had met kind people and cruel ones, people who judged him for his worn-out clothes and those who saw beyond them. But even now, even as one of the most recognizable faces in the world, he still found himself drawn to the simple things, to the unpolished truths about people. That's why he enjoyed these little experiments, stepping into the world as an ordinary person to see how people truly acted when they thought no one was watching. He wasn't playing a game. He wasn't looking to humiliate anyone. He just believed in the quiet power of kindness and how much it revealed about a person. The next morning, Keanu sat in the hotel lounge, stirring a cup of black coffee as his assistant, Mark, approached. Mark set down a tablet in front of him, pulling up a report. "Here's the brief on the taxi company acquisition. The board is expecting you at their headquarters this afternoon." Keanu took a sip of his coffee, then smiled. "Mark," he said casually, "you'll never guess what happened to me last night." Mark glanced up, eyebrows raised. Keanu told him everything, about the rain, the taxi driver, the immediate judgment in the man's eyes. How no amount of explanation or cash made a difference. Mark sighed, shaking his head. That happens more than you think. People assume things so quickly. Keanu leaned back, thinking, I wonder if he's coming to the meeting today. Mark frowned. The driver? Keanu nodded, still smiling. If he's been working there long enough, he might be. I hope he is. Mark smirked. And what happens if he is? Keanu chuckled. I don't need revenge. I just need him to see. Because people didn't change through punishment. They changed through realization. And if there was one thing Keanu Reeves had learned, it was that the best way to change someone's heart wasn't through power. It was through grace. That afternoon, Keanu stepped into the boardroom of the taxi company's headquarters. Executives sat in pressed suits, shifting nervously in their seats, eager to impress their new CEO. Among them, Paul, the taxi driver from last night, sat at the far end of the room, oblivious. Keanu took a seat at the head of the table. The room fell silent. Good afternoon, everyone, Keanu began, his voice warm yet firm. I'm looking forward to working with all of you to improve this company. Paul, completely unaware, lazily sipped his coffee, still not paying attention. The conference room buzzed with hushed conversations, the taxi company executives shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. They had all heard the news. A new CEO was taking over today. Paul, sitting near the back, yawned and leaned back in his chair, barely paying attention. He had worked here for years. He had seen CEOs come and go. Rich suits who never stepped foot in an actual cab, never caring about the people who kept the company running. This one would be no different, Paul thought. The door opened and Keanu Reeves walked in. Silence crashed over the room. Paul, mid-sip of his coffee, nearly choked. His grip on the cup slipped, and hot liquid splashed onto the table. The man from last night, the so-called broke guy he had thrown out of his cab, was now standing at the head of the table, smiling at the entire boardroom. Keanu looked directly at Paul. Paul felt like the floor had disappeared beneath him. Keanu took a calm seat, adjusting his cuffs. Good afternoon, everyone, he said. His voice was warm, steady, full of presence. I know you're all wondering why I'm here. Some of you have heard rumors. Let me clear things up. He leaned forward, clasping his hands together. I recently acquired this company because I believe in improving the human experience, even in the smallest ways. The executives nodded, murmuring in agreement, eager to impress. But Paul couldn't move. His breath was short, shallow. He felt his face burning. Keanu's words from last night echoed in his mind. Have a good night. At the time, he had brushed it off, smugly driving away. Now, sitting in front of him, the man he had humiliated wasn't just a passenger. He was his boss. Keanu smiled, scanning the room. I want this company to be different, he continued, not just in profits, but in how we treat people. Paul felt the words slam into his chest. Keanu was not calling him out directly, but every word felt like a message meant just for him. Every day, people get into our cabs with their own stories. Some are rushing to an interview, some are heading home after a long shift, some are just trying to get through the day. But they all deserve to be treated with dignity. Paul swallowed hard. Keanu looked around the room, letting the silence settle. And yet, he continued, too often we judge people too quickly. We assume we know their worth just by looking at them. Paul's hands were clammy. His colleague sat still, unaware of the storm inside him. Keanu finally looked at him directly. Sometimes we refuse to help someone because we think they have nothing to offer us. Paul gripped the armrests of his chair. Keanu's gaze held no anger, only understanding. For some reason, that made it worse. Paul's mind raced. He thought about all the people he had refused over the years. He had always told himself it was just business, that some people weren't worth the trouble. But sitting in this room, hearing his own actions reflected back at him, he felt exposed in a way he never had before. What if I had just given him a ride? He would have made a few bucks. He would have gone home that night like always. And today he would be sitting here without shame. Keanu took a deep breath, then leaned back. I want us to be more than just a taxi company, he said. I want us to be a company that chooses kindness. The boardroom nodded in agreement. Paul, for the first time in his life, felt truly small. Keanu didn't have to fire him. He had already changed him, and that was far more powerful. Paul sat frozen in his chair, every muscle stiff with shame. He had assumed power over the man last night. He had laughed at him, dismissed him, rejected him. And yet Keanu wasn't humiliating him. He wasn't calling him out in front of the executives. He was offering him a chance to realize his own mistake, to sit with it, to let it change him. That somehow felt heavier than any punishment. The room remained silent as Keanu continued his speech, his voice steady, full of warmth. "I want to introduce a new company initiative," he said. "Once a week, our taxis will offer free rides to people in need. Those trying to get to job interviews, hospitals, shelters, no questions asked." The executives nodded, murmuring in agreement. Paul felt his stomach twist. If this policy had existed last night, he wouldn't have been able to refuse Keanu. He wouldn't have looked into a man's eyes and assumed he was worthless. Keanu continued, "And as an incentive, I want to recognize and reward drivers not just for how much they earn, but for how they treat people." Paul swallowed hard. This wasn't about punishment. This was about creating a culture where kindness mattered. The weight in Paul's chest became unbearable. He had to say something. His chair screeched against the floor as he slowly stood up. All eyes turned toward him. Keanu's gaze met his, calm and patient. Paul cleared his throat, his voice shaking slightly. I need to say something," he began. The room stilled. Paul took a deep breath. "Last night His throat tightened. How could he even explain? He glanced at Keanu, searching for anger, judgment, any sign that he had already been condemned. But all he saw was understanding. Paul swallowed, forcing himself to continue. "I refused a ride to someone," he admitted. I thought he was just another guy trying to get something for free. I judged him without even giving him a chance." Murmurs rippled through the room. Paul clenched his fists. "If I had just looked past what I assumed, I would have seen him for who he really was." He turned to Keanu directly. "And I would have seen that he was my boss." The room went dead silent. The executive's head snapped toward Keanu, realization dawning. Keanu didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled gently. Paul's voice broke slightly. "I'm sorry," he said, his words heavy with regret. Keanu studied Paul for a moment, then finally spoke. "I appreciate that," he said. Paul exhaled, relief washing over him. Keanu leaned forward slightly. "But tell me something," he said, his voice soft but pointed. Paul nodded hesitantly. "If you had given that man a ride last night," Keanu asked, "would your life be any worse today?" Paul's breath hitched. He knew the answer instantly, and it shattered him. "No," he admitted quietly. Keanu smiled. "Then why not choose kindness next time?" Paul felt his throat close up. There was no anger in Keanu's voice, no punishment, just a simple, undeniable truth. You never lose anything by being kind. A month had passed since the boardroom meeting, and something had changed in Paul. He wasn't the same driver anymore. He no longer judged passengers before they got in his cab. He no longer assumed who could or couldn't afford a ride, because he finally understood that kindness costs nothing, but it can mean everything. It was late at night, and the city streets were quiet. Paul's cab idled near a bus stop, waiting for a fare, when he noticed a man in tattered clothes hesitating on the curb. The man glanced at the cab nervously, as if expecting to be turned away. Paul recognized that look. It was the same look Keanu had given him that night in the rain. Paul rolled down the window. "Hey, buddy," he called out. "You need a ride?" The man hesitated. I don't have enough cash." Paul smiled. "Don't worry about it. Get in." The man's eyes widened. He hadn't expected that answer. He climbed in slowly, still wary. Paul pulled away from the curb, glancing at him in the mirror. "Where you headed?" "The shelter on 5th, the man said, voice quiet. "They might have a bed open tonight." Paul nodded, his grip tightening on the wheel. He had refused so many people like this before. Now he wondered, how many of them just needed a little kindness? Across the street, inside a sleek black car, Keanu Reeves watched the exchange unfold. His driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Do you want me to call another cab, sir?" Keanu smiled, shaking his head. "No," he said softly. "That one's just fine." His gaze lingered on Paul's taxi as it disappeared into the night, carrying its passenger toward hope instead of rejection. Keanu leaned back in his seat, feeling lighter. He never needed Paul to pay for his mistake. He just needed him to understand it. And now he finally had. Paul pulled up to the shelter, turning off the meter before the man could see the fare. "Here you go, buddy," Paul said. The man hesitated, his voice cracking with emotion. "Thank you," Paul smiled. "No worries, man. Have a good night." And as he pulled away, he realized that's all Keanu had said to him that night. "Have a good night." And somehow those four simple words had changed everything.